All right, so you can see I have added my background, and now it's time for me to start moving forward and add, uh, paint the next steps on my face. So this is kind of a multi-step process, and what we begin with doing is looking at the portrait and identifying what the very lightest value is. And so you'll see that as I paint, I have certain things visible to me all the time. So, thing one, obviously, I have my painting right here, and I have the photograph that I'm working from. If I'm working from that on my Chromebook, I would just have that visible so that I can see that the whole time. Or if I'm working from the printout that came in the kit, you can see I've got it sitting. It's right here. It's right next to my painting. I would never paint with this gone because then I'm just trying to paint her portrait from my imagination, and without a ton of practice, like that just doesn't work. Like you have to have years and years and years of portrait practice before you can successfully create a realistic looking portrait without looking at a photo. And it's always going to be better if you look at some sort of reference. Also, you'll see the next thing that I have, paintbrush, water, but I have this little value scale that I made for reference. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm looking at the portrait that I'm painting, and I'm looking for the very lightest of the colors that are on the portrait. And really the very lightest is like here, this highlight inside her eyes, and then this highlight on her cheek. And I can see that this on her cheek is a little bit darker than the bit that's above her eyebrow here. So I'm going to aim for this kind of light color. And when I'm looking up here at this purple, I don't think this purple is light enough, but I'm seeing out here in my background that I was able to get a really light purple here. And so that's the color that I'm aiming to start with, or the value of paint that I'm aiming to start with. If you're struggling to see what your color values look like in gray, a black and white photo can be super helpful. So you can switch your camera to black and white, and then it makes these not be purple anymore. It changes them to all the colors of gray, and then you can kind of reference where is this color gray on her portrait. Now, if I were painting this other person, their face has a little different value structure, and this would work as this very lightest value. So the very lightest value on his portrait is this highlight here up and around his eyes, the tip of his nose, there's some on his forehead, and this would be perfect for me to start from. So what we're gonna do is paint the entire face with that very, very, very lightest of values. And so what I'm gonna do is I put water in my tray, and I put just the tiniest bit of paint down, and right away I can see, oh, maybe that's not light enough, so I grabbed a little more water, and I am just going to paint everywhere with that. If when you start this it's too dark, like you've lost that sense of highlight, you need to quickly add water, because we want this to be, like I said, this is that lightest of color. And you can, I'm going right over her eyes. I am going over everything with this super light paint. So like here, ooh, I went and got new paint. It's too dark, but it happens to be in this darker shadow. So lucky me, it will work out. But I do need to just grab some clean water out of my bucket, and you can see clean water is making that a little bit lighter, not necessarily lighter enough. So I want to make sure that I'm not pushing that past where I need it to go. So I've cleaned my paintbrush off, and you can see I can pull paint out of there. And I can add some more water again to make sure that we start as light as possible. So making a portrait is all about subtle, gradual value changes, shadow changes. And while this is still a little wet, I can go ahead and look for where her face is a little darker and just put in a second like layer of paint. So I'm watching where these shadows are, and I'm just letting that paint kind of drift in the water that I have. And I've outlined in my transfer process some of those shadows because I knew that I would need them to paint. So she has a little light lines on her face. If you feel like your lines ended up too dark and you're worried about your paint not going over them now, you certainly can use an eraser to lighten them up. I'm switching now to clean water. So I have some weird like dark shapes on her face and lines that aren't there. So I cleaned my paintbrush off, and I'm going to dry it mostly. And now what I'm going to do is just kind of gently move that paint around. So I've got this like weird thing happening here on the bridge of her nose. But you can see that with a clean paintbrush, I need to clean my paintbrush off, make it a little dry again. With a clean paintbrush, I can go in and I can smooth out some of those hard lines in the color in the paint. Making a portrait is all about just adding the shadows a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time. So it is a process, and at a certain point you do have to just sort of let it dry. So her face looks a little strange right now, and that's pretty normal because the paint is really wet. I can't add a lot more. She does have this really dark shadow here, so I can like try to bump some darker color in. Kind of clean my paintbrush off again. I don't want it to go too far, so I'm going to just bump this back down into this kind of zone where the shadow is definitely darker. And I'm going to now get to the place, you can see that my painting is really wet. My paint is not staying where I want it to stay. And that's a sign that I need to let it sit and dry, because I'm not going to be able to successfully work with this anymore right now until things kind of dry a little bit and set up. So know that that's also a normal part of the process, is that you're going to paint and need to let it dry. You can force it dry if you happen to have a blow dryer at home. In the classroom at Coon Rapids High School, we have blow dryers, and in a painting class we use them quite a bit. So if you have a blow dryer, you could go ahead and use one. Otherwise, it's just a matter of letting it like dry, coming back to it in half an hour or an hour, and having your paint be more dry, and then moving forward from there. So don't rush it, like I said, and then also know that things will look scary for a while. Don't give up. One light layer to start with. Start bumping in some shadows.